This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. July 1996 was a strange time in the world. Early that month, Nelson Mandela stepped down as South Africa's president, and the British pop group Spice Girls would release their first single, Wannabe, the very next day. On the 17th, Paris-bound flight TWA 800 exploded off the coast of New York, killing 230. That month also saw sports goats Michael Jordan and Wayne Gretzky sign new contracts with the Chicago Bulls and New York Rangers respectively, while one of the favorite athletes of my childhood, future MLB Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett, announced his retirement from the game. Meanwhile, on July 19th, the Summer Olympic Games would open up in Atlanta, Georgia, an opening that would go on to be remembered for non-athletic reasons. But at the same time these events were unfolding in America's heartland, a family was forced to endure the most nightmarish of situations, the disappearance of a child. And to this day, their anguish continues to reverberate throughout the region, despite the story being quickly overwhelmed and nearly forgotten about in the national conversation. This is the story of Morgan Violi. Morgan Violi, born on November 3, 1988, was just 7 years old in July of 1996. She was the third of three girls born to her mother, Stacy Pulliam, who had two daughters that were just a few years older than Morgan. Morgan was the only child biologically fathered by her dad, Glenn Violi, but he had married Stacy's mother the year before Morgan was born in 1987 and raised the other two girls as his own. He was, for all intents and purposes, their father. Morgan and her family would live together in Bowling Green, Kentucky, located about 1 hour north of Nashville, Tennessee. There, things did not go quite as Morgan's parents, Glenn and Stacy, had envisioned. Their relationship was struggling to survive as they raised their three daughters, and in July of 1993, when Morgan was just about 4 years old, Stacy filed for divorce. After attempting to reconcile the relationship, they agreed to dismiss the motion for divorce months later. 3 years after that, however, in March of 1996, she filed again for divorce. By July of that year, when this story takes place, that motion was still working its way through the courts, but more on that in a bit. As the divorce proceeded, Morgan lived with her mother and sisters at the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, located along Shive Lane, less than a mile away from Interstate 65. It was an easy place to find, even for those that did not know the area, because of its close proximity to the highway. Morgan and her two sisters, Heather and Nikki, who were 11 and 10 years old at the time respectively, shared a bedroom at their mother's apartment, but also went to stay with their father regularly. Morgan had just recently finished up her first grade year at Warren Elementary School, where she was well liked by almost everyone. Her teacher, Janet Yeager, later recalled, "She was a good student, just an outgoing little girl. She was one of those kids that liked everything." Yet, Morgan was not exactly perfect. Her teacher and other family members recall that she liked to talk, a lot, something that occasionally got her into trouble at school. Bill Franklin, the Warren Elementary principal, later said, "She's a very outgoing girl. She
She's very talkative, a popular little girl.
By the sound of it, Morgan was an enthusiastic little girl with energy to burn as she approached her 8th birthday, and she loved to do cartwheels in the grass and land on her feet with a huge smile. She was always smiling, her mother recalled. She also loved to sing along to her favorite Mariah Carey songs and encouraged others to sing along with her. The assistant principal at her school, B. Isabel, said about Morgan,
"She and her friends would come up after class and sing me songs they had made up for me. She was a happy-go-lucky child."
Morgan aspired to be an artist and a writer when she was older, and seemed to have a future in being a performer of some kind. She was one of the only kids in her class to participate in the school's talent show, and as reported by the Courier-Journal, who later spoke to her teacher,
"She did a real good job."
For the most part, though, it seems like Morgan was just a kid. She liked to goof around with her friends, she liked to play, she liked to ride her pink bike around outside. She was a kid that enjoyed life, and was still in the frustrating yet rewarding process of finding out who she was, as recounted by her aunt, Bobby Stubblefield.
"I will remember Morgan's little face when she didn't get her way, and boy, she loved to get her way. She loved people, and she loved to be the center of attention."
Her father, Glenn Violi, later told reporters,
"She's real sassy. She's 7 and she thinks she's 15. She's very, very grown up for her age. I'm hoping that's going to get her out of this."
Wednesday, July 24th, 1996, was a hot day in the southern Kentucky area, with temperatures reaching near 90 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the day. Through the middle part of the day, Morgan and her sisters were inside and then outside, alternating every so often as the apartment complex buzzed with children in the midst of summer break. A little while after noon, Morgan's sister Nikki recalled that she was heading back to the family's apartment on her bike when a man driving a maroon van drove past her. 10-year-old Nikki would remember that the side door to the van was open, which she thought was odd, but paid little attention to at the time. Without thinking about it, she interacted with the man, later telling WKRN,
"He waved, and I waved."
A short time beforehand, 7-year-old Morgan had laid down on the couch with her mother, Stacy, and began watching TV. After a few minutes, Stacy began to drift off to sleep, and while she slept, Morgan slipped outside to go play with her friends. At around 12:35 p.m., Morgan was walking through one of the apartment parking lots with her friend, Destiny Miller. The man in the red-colored van that had just waved at Nikki drove up and stopped the van near Morgan and Destiny. He then got out and moved quickly toward the 2 defenseless children. At first, he attempted to pull in 6-year-old Destiny, but she was able to break free and run off. Sadly, his attention would then turn to Morgan, who he was able to grab a hold of. He then threw her into the passenger side of the van, climbing in over her and closing the door behind him. In that short amount of time, quicker than it's taken me to describe it, Morgan was abducted, with the van that she had been thrown into now speeding off toward nearby Scottsville Road. Neighbors woke up Stacy moments later, informing her that 7-year-old Morgan had just been abducted. 10-year-old Nikki, who was playing at another friend's apartment, thought that the screams were from other kids playing. Moments later, she would learn that this was no joke. Her own sister had been abducted. Glenn Violi, Morgan's father, arrived at the complex a little while later and was notified that Morgan had been kidnapped. When he was told this horrible detail, he yelled out, seemingly at no one in particular,
"Why didn't somebody try to stop him?"
Police had been contacted right after the crime occurred, and their response to the scene could only be described as immense. After the abduction was reported, officers began to swarm around the apartment building and began establishing searches for the missing young girl, closing off outbound roads and orchestrating searches of local businesses, motels, hotels, etc. Sadly though, the proximity of the apartment complex to the local highways, Interstate 65 and the William Natcher Parkway, made it hard for police to have much of an immediate impact. Even if the abductor had not known the area that well, they had likely just been able to get on the highway and out of the area almost immediately. By the time police arrived at the scene, the offender, and Morgan, could have been miles away. Just not out of the region, but out of the state. Within hours, they could have still been in Kentucky, or they could have gotten to Tennessee, Virginia, Ohio, Illinois, or Indiana. While the Bowling Green Police Department handled the immediate response to the crime scene, they quickly learned the details of this horrifying abduction and brought in the FBI to assist. For that, we can only applaud them for doing the right thing when so many other law enforcement agencies refuse to admit they've been outmatched by the circumstances. Sergeant Bill Key, a spokesman for the Bowling Green Police Department, told reporters,
"Our investigators will be following up on leads and interviewing people in the area. Some of our investigators will be working along with the FBI."
At the crime scene, suspicion lingered over several people connected to this story. Family members, friends, neighbors, acquaintances, etc. But by and large, investigators feared that this was a stranger-involved abduction, one of the rarer forms of kidnapping. Police tried to focus in on a description of the van that had abducted Morgan, and used statements from multiple witnesses to gather that it had been either maroon or burgundy colored, and appeared to be older, likely a late 70s or early 80s model Chevy. Additionally, it was theorized that the license plate likely started with an M or an N. Certain witnesses, such as a 14-year-old family friend, would claim that a van matching that description had been spotted in a nearby parking lot for at least a day or so, but authorities did not know whether that was true or not. Later, they would theorize that it was not. Descriptions of the man seen driving the van and abducting Morgan were disputed by some of the eyewitnesses, including Destiny, the friend that had narrowly escaped being abducted herself. She was just 6 years old and saw the man through a very traumatic ordeal, so police had to reconcile her description of the man with what other witnesses described, who had seen the man in the van in the vital minutes or hours surrounding the abduction. Initial police reports state that the abductor was a white man in his 20s who stood approximately 6 feet tall, with collar-length brown hair and 2 to 3 days worth of stubble on his cheeks, who was wearing a white t-shirt and blue jeans at the time. However, other witnesses described him as potentially being middle-aged, perhaps with short blonde hair or short curly brown hair. Because of this wide range of descriptions, it was originally suspected that there may have been 2 men involved in the abduction, perhaps a driver and another man, but that idea seems to have been dropped over time. Since Morgan's friend Destiny had initially been targeted for abduction by the man, it wasn't believed that Morgan had been specifically targeted for any one reason, making this likely a crime of opportunity. As investigators began trying to determine who had abducted Morgan Violi and why, other police officials began disseminating information about the missing girl, who was 7 years old, with brown hair, hazel eyes, stood around 3 feet 11 inches, and weighed approximately 44 pounds. At the time of her disappearance, she was wearing a white V-neck short-sleeved shirt, white shorts with multicolored stripes, pink shoes, and a yellow hair barrette. She had an oval-shaped birthmark on her left calf, and some scrapes on her right knee and her left foot because of a bicycle accident that had taken place the day before the abduction. A reminder of her young age, that she was in the throes of youth when her only worries should have been riding her bike and trying to stay out of the summer heat, not living through a nightmare like this. Dave Cole, the special agent in charge of the FBI in Kentucky, told the public at a press conference held the day of Morgan's abduction, July 24th.
"We're keeping our fingers crossed and praying that she's recovered safe and sound."
From the time that police arrived at the scene of the crime, the apartment complex where Morgan lived with her mother and sisters, officers tried to learn as much as they could about the situation. Ultimately, they ended up conducting a massive search throughout the area, with officers and other volunteers looking for Morgan or any sign of the van that she had been taken away in. They knocked on hundreds of doors, conducted thousands of interviews, and spoke to a countless number of people in their search for the missing 7-year-old. However, many investigators wondered if the truth might lie closer to home, perhaps in the form of a close relative. After all, even back in 1996, it was well known that abductions of children overwhelmingly involve family members, as documented by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. At the time of Morgan's abduction, her parents had been going through a rather tumultuous divorce. Earlier that morning, in fact, July 24th, a custody hearing had taken place, in which Stacy, Morgan's mother, was given custody of all 3 girls. Her father Glenn had also been ordered to pay child support, as well as Stacy's court cost. Glenn himself wasn't present at the hearing because he had been at work, sending his lawyer to appear for him, but that's because he and Stacy had come to an agreement beforehand. At that point in the morning, things seemed amicable. But then, Morgan's abduction happened. Glenn Violi was no longer living at the apartment he had once shared with his wife and daughters. And if you recall, he wasn't present for the abduction. Instead, he had showed up 15 to 20 minutes afterward, and reportedly called out once he learned of the abduction.
Why didn't anybody try to stop him?
As you can imagine, investigators were keen to take a gander at Glenn and determine if he might have been responsible. If he, perhaps in a fit of rage, had orchestrated the abduction of his own daughter so that her mother, his pending ex-wife, could no longer have her. If anything, this was a theory that investigators needed to rule out. In the days that followed Morgan's abduction, Glenn was questioned extensively, and his alibi was checked out. A self-employed construction worker, Glenn claimed that he had been at work at the time of the abduction, and that information was checked by police. Glenn did operate his own small construction company, and had indeed been with his crew of 6 men between 6:30 and 11 a.m. After that, he dropped off the rest of the crew in his truck, and then drove into town to pay some bills. There, in Bowling Green, he then dropped into the Brass Box to get fitted for a friend's wedding, and then stopped into Betty's flower shop. There, he bought some flowers for Stacy, believing that their recent cordial conversations might lead to a potential reconciliation. If so, then surely flowers could help soften things even further. But by the time Glenn arrived at the Colony Apartments at approximately 12:50 p.m., things had already descended into pandemonium. Later, when speaking to reporters about the circumstances of their divorce, Stacy defended her soon-to-be ex-husband, stating,
"The court thing was really no big deal, really. Me and Glenn, our past history has been pretty rocky. But if he was going to take one daughter, he would have taken all 3. He loves the other 2 just as much as he does Morgan."
Yet, even then it was noted by many in the press that Morgan was the only child that was biologically Glenn's. Her 2 sisters had been fathered by another man who died, and Glenn had stepped in when they were very young to become, ostensibly, their father. In fact, when the divorce began, Glenn petitioned for custody of all 3, not just Morgan. And on July 24th, the agreement that the 2 parents had made, for Morgan and her sisters to primarily live with their mother Stacy, but see Glenn every other weekend, had just been accepted by the court roughly 2 hours before Morgan's abduction. If nothing else, the timing was incredibly suspect to investigators early on. As the press attempted to dig into the gritty details of the divorce, they discovered that it was more tumultuous than Glenn or Stacy had originally let on. When Stacy had filed for divorce earlier that March, she had taken out an emergency protective order against her husband, claiming that he'd put a gun to her head and threatened to kill her. As a result, Glenn was later ordered to undergo counseling for both substance abuse and domestic violence. That protective order actually remained in effect until July 29th, 5 days after Morgan's abduction, when Stacy wrote to the court,
"Her father needs to be with us when she returns or calls."
Despite the smoke, however, there seems to have been very little fire. There was seemingly no tangible evidence linking Glenn to this crime. His alibi checked out, and the idea that he might have theoretically hired or put up someone to abduct his daughter seemed flimsy at best, with nothing factual to back it. Stacy herself would even come to her ex-husband's defense, telling the press that she was assured Glenn wasn't involved.
"I do not feel he had anything to do with it. He wouldn't harm our children."
But in the weeks that followed, Glenn would find himself being brought in for numerous police interviews and even asked to take part in upwards of 5 polygraph tests, almost all of which he failed conclusively. In August of 1996, he told reporters about the most recent polygraph, administered on August 20th.
"I failed it. I failed all the lie detector tests from what they're telling me. I wish I could pass one just so they could go do something else. My opinion is they don't know any more right now than the day she got took. If they did, they wouldn't be harassing me so bad about it. If they had leads that were leading them somewhere, they would be leaving me alone, don't you think?"
Now, I would like to just take a moment to point out that polygraph tests aren't at all reliable. They're junk science, and are not admissible in court, so please take these failures with a colossal grain of salt. But at the time, polygraphs were still widely used by law enforcement to determine truthfulness, and these failures were widely reported by the local press, so they are still relevant to this story. And because of Glenn's series of polygraph failures, investigators continued to investigate him as a potential suspect. And as they continued to circle around him, Glenn criticized the FBI for what he believed to be a waste of time, telling reporters in August of 1996,
"They're telling me they know I did it."
Years later, Glenn's ex-wife and his 2 daughters don't believe he had anything to do with Morgan's abduction. You'd think if anyone had suspicion to cast upon Glenn, it would be Stacy, his ex-wife, who already had an up-and-down relationship with the man. But throughout this entire story, she consistently reiterated her belief that for all of his faults, Glenn would never willingly harm their children. And their other 2 daughters, Heather and Nikki, agree, with both telling investigators that the man they'd seen abduct Morgan was someone that they had never seen before. He was definitely not their father. It would be months before officials with the FBI came out with a statement seeming to clear Glenn Violi of any involvement in his daughter's disappearance. The following year, FBI spokesman Ed Evans would state,
"We never named him as a suspect in the case, and we still aren't."
As I just went over, investigators initially theorized that a family member or a close relative might have been involved in the abduction of Morgan Violi. Statistically speaking, most child abductions are perpetrated by someone known to them. Yet in the statistically rare child abductions that are perpetrated by strangers, they are often carried out in an identical way as Morgan's, with a car coming in close and a stranger physically pulling them in off the street. As stated by Julie Cartwright, the spokesman for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 1996.
"Most often, these children are lured with the purposes of committing another crime, such as sexual assault. That is a primary motivation."
Sadly, that was believed to be the case here. Investigators had likely somewhat hoped that someone like Morgan's father had abducted her, as that possibility seemed morbid enough, but allowed the remote possibility of Morgan returning home safely. It was far more preferable to a stranger abducting her, likely for some selfish motivation that was unlikely to result in her coming home unharmed. Fearing the worst, authorities operated under the belief that a stranger had abducted Morgan and likely had the intent of doing her harm. As they began their search for the missing girl, they began combing through police records for any reports on vans similar to the one that had been seen driving away with Morgan. They would even ask for the surrounding states to contribute, realizing that the abductor had easy access to interstate highways as he made his escape. Police officers would even begin making stops at local hotels, motels, restaurants, and even locations like toy stores, theorizing that the abductor might have stopped by some places like that after making off with the 7-year-old from Bowling Green. While initial witness reports alleged seeing the burgundy or maroon van in the parking lot of the Colony apartment complex for upwards of a day, authorities later zeroed in on multiple reports claiming it had arrived at the apartment complex parking lot roughly 10 minutes before the abduction took place, just before 12:30 on July 24, 1996. It was probable that the offender spent a few minutes watching Morgan play with her friend Destiny, waiting for a moment to enact his grisly plan. He then drove up and attempted to abduct the 6-year-old Destiny first, before she ran off and he grabbed Morgan instead. After that, he was gone. And weeks later, investigators still had no idea where he had gone to, or who he was. The day after Morgan's abduction, July 25th, residents of the area gathered at the apartment building she lived at in order to show support for her family. In total, more than 400 people arrived and took part in a candlelight vigil and would spend the next several weeks hanging yellow ribbons everywhere, a reminder that Morgan was still missing. During the vigil, which ended at the doorstep of the Violi home, their pastor, Reverend Steve Ayers of Hillview Heights Baptist Church, told those gathered,
"We're going to pray whoever this person is that would engage in such a hideous evil act, that somewhere there is still a minute conscience that would turn from this deed and correct this thing."
Despite the public show of support for the family, an ominous cloud would hang over the area for the foreseeable future, which was especially noticeable at the apartment complex that Morgan had been abducted from. This was the first stranger-related abduction of a child in the Bowling Green area in recent memory, perhaps ever. So the residents were in a state of grief and weren't sure how to process it. America's Most Wanted aired a segment on Morgan's abduction just days after it occurred, in the final week of July, and then re-aired the same segment a week later, in early August. As a result, the reward offered for information leading to Morgan's whereabouts grew from the initial $5,000 offered by the city to more than $16,500 in a week. By the following week, in the second airing of the America's Most Wanted segment, it had grown to more than $20,000. This publicity also led to a barrage of tips from people that had seen girls matching Morgan's description, or thought that they might have seen the red van that she had last been seen in. Pat Thomas, a police spokesman, even remarked,
"We're getting one tip every 10 to 15 minutes.
Within a couple of weeks, authorities had received nearly 1,000 tips, including dozens that followed the airing of the story on America's Most Wanted, as well as an appearance that Morgan's mother made on Sally Jesse Raphael. Days later, roughly 1 week after the abduction, Stacy held a press conference alongside 2 other mothers, whose children had also been abducted or gone missing in recent weeks. Together, they pleaded for the safe return of their children, and Stacy asked for the abductor to have mercy on Morgan, who was just 7 years old.
Just drop her off. I just want Morgan back. She needs to be with us."
Wes Violi, Morgan's grandfather, also appeared at the press conference. He showed support for not just Morgan, but his ex-daughter-in-law, and shared a similar sentiment that he hoped the abductor would hear.
"If you have any decency in your heart, please let her go."
Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Sadly, as the days began to turn into weeks, the urgency that had once been felt by the public at large began to fade away into disappointment. Morgan Jade Violi, just 7 years old, still hadn't been found, and there were very few apparent clues pointing to her current location. A strange, unidentified man had abducted her, after first attempting to abduct a friend of hers, and just like that, in just a few seconds, Morgan had been ripped out of her life. Away from her parents, her siblings, her other family members and friends and loved ones, and she had been whisked away to parts unknown. Authorities eventually put together a second, more comprehensive police sketch. The first one that they had released in the hours after Morgan's abduction had been computer-generated and centered around the original witness statements. The second was drawn by an actual sketch artist that spoke to several witnesses and looked much more lifelike. It also included details that weren't included in the original description, such as the offender being between 20 and 30 years old, having a slender build with defined muscles, and a sharp, distinct nose, which authorities would repeatedly try to highlight as a defining trait. Despite this, however, more than a month after Morgan's abduction, FBI Special Agent Ed Evans admitted that investigators had compiled more than 1,000 leads in their ongoing search, but the nationwide manhunt for Morgan hadn't gotten their intended results.
"We're still pursuing all the investigative leads we have. There's nothing new at this point."
In late September, a brief glimmer of hope emerged when a waitress in Ohio reported seeing Morgan. Dawn Kurth, an Applebee's waitress from Fairview Park, near Cleveland, claimed to have seen a girl matching Morgan's description at her restaurant. She says that the girl was seated along with a couple, with the man reportedly looking like the police sketch recently distributed by police. Described as rough-looking, the man was seated next to a woman wearing a lot of makeup and a wig. The waitress claimed that the couple looked sad and withdrawn, and that the girl spent most of the time at the restaurant looking down while she colored. Dawn also claimed that she tried to strike up a conversation with the little girl, asking her about her school and her grades, but that the woman sitting next to her quickly changed the subject. While this seemed like an exciting possibility, that perhaps maybe Morgan was still alive, it was sadly not to be. Just a few weeks later, a discovery was made miles away across the Tennessee border. On Sunday, October 20th, 1996, a woman was hiking on a rural property in Robertson County, in a small town called White House. Located just off of Interstate 65 near Springfield, Tennessee, White House is about 40 miles south of Bowling Green, and roughly 15 miles south of the Kentucky-Tennessee border. While hiking, this woman discovered what appeared to be a body. Local police were called to the scene that day, and they would call out the FBI soon afterward when it was discovered that the remains were that of a child. Originally, investigators had theorized that the remains belonged to a local woman that had been missing since 1991, but an initial examination of the remains clued investigators into the victim's young age. Specifically, her teeth and arms appeared to befit someone between the ages of 6 and 9 years old. These initial findings were disclosed to the public the next day, October 21st, when the FBI's chief agent in Kentucky, David Cole, told the reporters,
"There are a number of indicators that lead us to think this may be Morgan. However, we are not ready at this time to say this is definitively her."
He also added, reminding us that even hardened federal agents struggle with this type of stuff.
"It's the type of thing that literally tears your heart out."
At the time, there were not a lot of missing children's cases from the area matching the specific factors of Morgan's case. That's partially what made her story such a big deal in the regional reporting, but also made it so that investigators were reasonably assured at the time that the remains belonged to her. Sadly, that theory would be confirmed. At the time of her body's discovery, roughly 3 months after she had gone missing, Morgan Violi had been dead for some time. Her remains were decomposed to the point of being skeletonized, and her body had likely been there, roughly 50 yards away from a nearby barn, in a drainage ditch, for anywhere between 2 and 3 months. Roughly the same amount of time that she had been missing. Her remains were unclothed at the time of their discovery, but it's unknown if her clothing was recovered nearby, or at all. The yellow beret and ponytail band that she had had in her hair were found on her remains, and those were later matched up with similar items left behind at Morgan's home. For that reason, police knew early on that these were Morgan Violi's remains, but they would still send them off to undergo extensive forensic testing and examination. Morgan's remains were sent off to Dr. William Bass, a forensic anthropologist in Knoxville, in order to undergo an autopsy as well as to officially determine identity. 2 days later, on Wednesday, it was determined that hair samples from the body were consistent with Morgan Violi's, and that an examination from Dr. Bass showed the placement from the front teeth were nearly identical to Morgan's, although he had to conclude that from pictures because Morgan, just 7 years old, did not have any conclusive dental records. While not a 100% match, this was enough to conclude that the body was most likely Morgan Violi's. Additional DNA analysis would take months to confirm. FBI spokesman Ed Evans told reporters,
"It all adds up. It's as close as we can get without being 100%.
Sadly, an official cause of death would not be determined due to the decomposition that had already taken place when the remains were found, as stated by Dr. Bass in his report.
I doubt we'll ever know."
As police officials began transitioning this from a missing persons case to an interstate murder investigation, Morgan's family had to endure her tragic loss all over again. For 3 months, they had hoped beyond belief that she would return home. Perhaps different, maybe changed in an irrevocable way, but alive. Now they had to accept that was never going to happen, that their lives would forever have a hole in them, gaps in their conscience where Morgan once existed, but now only remained in spirit, a memory that was getting more distant by the day. Morgan's family were informed of this grisly discovery on October 21st, the day after the remains had been found down in Tennessee. They were also told that investigators were confident the remains were hers. Afterward, the signs in front of their home, which read "Come home, Morgan," were taken down, and Morgan's loved ones would begin replacing the hopeful yellow ribbons they'd hung around town with purple ribbons, purple being Morgan's favorite color. While investigators were fairly confident that the remains belonged to Morgan, her family members remained hopeful that the body found wasn't their missing 7-year-old, that this was all just a tragic mistake. But weeks later, in November, a forensic pathologist at the University of Tennessee named Murray Marks was able to use photographic superimposition to match a photograph of Morgan with a video of her skull, as recounted by Marks per the Courier-Journal.
"The teeth were a perfect match. They fit like a glove."
A statement released by the FBI shortly thereafter concluded,
The skeletal remains of a child between 6.5 and 8.5 years of age, which were discovered in a wooded area in Robertson County, Tennessee, were positively identified through photographic superimposition as Morgan Jade Violi.
DNA test would further confirm the identity of Morgan's remains in July of 1997. After this initial confirmation, the remains were released to the family, and her funeral and memorial service were scheduled for that week, with Morgan being laid to rest in a bright purple casket. Meanwhile, at Warren Elementary School, where Morgan would have been immersed in the 2nd grade, a seat in her classroom remained empty for the rest of the school year. The area where Morgan Violi's body was discovered, in North Tennessee, was no stranger to this strange type of occurrence. Robertson County Sheriff Ted Embry would tell reporters,
"It's a rare thing for us to have a homicide in our county that has a tie to our county."
But he continued,
"It's an easy place for somebody to drop off the interstate and commit a crime."
The location where Morgan's body was dumped was right off of Interstate 65, which ran throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. Early on, investigators had theorized that Morgan's abductor had made a quick getaway on the same interstate, and this finding seemed to confirm that. After finding the remains, investigators began questioning locals, and a few that lived nearby recounted seeing a pair of suspicious vans in the area at around the time that Morgan disappeared. The first was a sighting of a suspicious reddish van that was seen in the area on July 24th, 1996, at around 2:30 p.m., just about 2 hours after Morgan's abduction. In that sighting, the red van had been seen just yards away from where Morgan's body was later found. The second sighting, however, took place the next day, on July 25th. That sighting involved a separate van, which appeared to be white in color and was seen parked nearby the barn next to the drainage ditch where Morgan's body was later found. The sighting of this van caused police to reevaluate their ongoing leads. Per Bowling Green police officer Robert Cron, who told reporters with the Park City Daily News,
"We're going back through leads that we've had all along. There's a re-emphasis on trying to locate the van."
In the weeks that followed, at least one man was questioned for potential involvement in this crime. A 21-year-old from Louisville was questioned by police following his arrest in Jefferson County on an attempted rape charge, yet investigators seemed to quickly rule him out as a suspect. Per FBI spokesman Ed Evans,
"We interviewed him and it didn't wash out. It was determined he could not have been at the scene."
This was just one of more than 1,700 interviews conducted by the FBI up to this point, just 4 or so months after the abduction of Morgan Violi had taken place. But after this, things would begin to grow relatively quiet for the foreseeable future, while Morgan's family and friends grieved and tried to heal. However, they all found it hard to believe that the strong, headstrong, smiling little girl they had all known and loved had been taken away from them, while the person that ended her life was still out there. Family friend Ed Ramsey stated,
"It makes me angry there is still a monster out there doing such a thing. I just hope they catch him before he does it again."
It wasn't until March of 1997 that the next big discovery would be made. That's after the break. On Wednesday, March 19th, 1997, authorities announced that they had found the van that Morgan Violi had been abducted in the year prior. Surprisingly, the vehicle had been recovered by police just 2 days after the abduction, all the way back in July of 1996. But it had taken several months to get back results from a forensic examination, which confirmed it had been the vehicle used in the abduction. Police would remain pretty mum on the specific details of how they confirmed it was the vehicle, in order to protect the integrity of their investigation, but they were sure that it was indeed the van used by Morgan's abductor. The vehicle was a 1978 Chevrolet van that was burgundy in color. It had been reported stolen at around 5 a.m. on July 23rd, the day before Morgan's abduction, in Dayton, Ohio. The owner was an elderly man that was not believed to be linked to the crime. It had been found abandoned 2 days after the abduction, on July 26th, at a Union 76 truck stop in Franklin, Tennessee. The license plate on the van had previously belonged to a car from a salvage yard in Springfield, Ohio, not too far away from Dayton. As I mentioned earlier, witnesses had reported seeing a similar van roughly 50 yards away from the area where Morgan's body had been dumped approximately 2 hours after her abduction. By piecing together these facts, we can surmise that the abductor had dumped Morgan's body there just a couple of hours after abducting her, and then disposed of the van at the truck stop roughly 45 miles south. Unsurprisingly, the truck stop was located right off of Interstate 65, which had a connection to not only the location of the abduction, but also the placement of Morgan's remains. All 3 locations were no more than a stone's throw away from the interstate. After discovering the van in July, the FBI had brought in forensics teams to search over every inch of the van and document everything that they found. They then released it back to its owner in November of 1996, and then got their findings in March of 1997. By then, the original owner had taken back possession of the vehicle and sold it off. Although again, he was an elderly man and was not suspected of any involvement, having reported it stolen the day before the abduction. In response to this news, critics of the FBI's investigation were a bit miffed that the van they had spent months searching for had been in police custody the entire time, since just 2 days after Morgan had been kidnapped. Most of the public awareness campaign to find Morgan had seemingly been centered around trying to locate this van. But in the FBI's defense, authorities stated that the results of the forensic analysis had only come back a few weeks prior to this public disclosure, and that was when they knew for sure it had been the van used in the abduction. Glenn Violi, Morgan's father and the FBI's biggest critic in this case, had suspected for over a month that authorities had the van. He suspected so when, back in February, federal investigators had asked him to supply his fingerprints. This factoid indicates to me that fingerprints were recovered from the van, a possible investigative lead that remains open. However, in making this announcement, authorities announced yet another lead that they had been working on for some time, that they were searching for a 1978 white Ford van, which had also reportedly been seen at the location where Morgan's body was discovered near White House, Tennessee. This was a completely different vehicle, which was apparently unique in that it had a custom louvered window on the passenger's side sliding door. While the burgundy van had been seen at this location by at least one witness on July 24th, the date of Morgan's abduction, this white van had been seen at the barn just yards away from her body on July 25th, the day after it. While authorities wouldn't reveal the specific circumstances that this witness report was made under, they did disclose that the van was parked near where the maroon van had last been seen, and likely had an Ohio license plate. It had also been parked near the old barn for approximately 4 hours, less than 100 feet from Morgan's remains. This seemed to be more than a simple coincidence, especially since this area rarely saw people park near there. The white van had been seen by a local to White House named Kim Farrell, who saw the van parked along North Swith Road from her house nearby. At the time, she had been following the abduction story in the news, but she heard that police were looking for a burgundy or maroon van, so she refrained from calling police when she saw the white van parked near the barn. She later recalled to the Park City Daily News,
"I told myself they're looking for a red van, not a white van."
With this news, police also released another new sketch of the suspect, which was noticeably different from the first. Officials refused to clarify how this new sketch had been compiled, nor how many witnesses had seen Morgan's abductor, but they described him as a white man in his mid-20s, who stood between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighed around 140 pounds, had light brown hair, a muscular build, and a tan complexion. To date, authorities insist that this sketch is the most accurate depiction of Morgan's abductor, and I will make sure to attach a link to this police sketch in the show notes of the podcast. In the months and years that followed Morgan Violi's death, her presence would be felt by those that knew and loved her. Her mother, Stacy, talked repeatedly about how she still felt an immense amount of guilt and was unlikely to ever truly heal from Morgan's loss. In many of her public comments, she alluded to her having promised to always be there for her daughters, but not being there for Morgan when she was most needed.
"I should have been there."
To the Park City Daily News, Stacy stated,
I miss her. It's like there's a hole, that something's missing and it will never be filled again. This person is going to have to look at me when they find him and to know what he has done. Not only to me, to my daughters, but to a little girl. A little girl who will never grow up, who will never get the chances that this person had.
In comments made even later on, Stacy would maintain that her life was forever diminished and void of happiness. Meanwhile, Morgan's father, Glenn, told reporters with the Courier-Journal that he couldn't work in the area anymore and rarely left his home. Rather, he spent hours inside, sketching the face of the person who was believed to have killed Morgan, which was based on descriptions he had heard of and gathered from the witnesses, but was separate from the police sketches.
I used to get up and go to work, but now I can't even do that anymore because no one will hire me. It's because people think I killed her, and they don't want somebody like me on their job. It's obvious to me because they just don't call anymore.
After Morgan's disappearance and death, Glenn and Stacy's divorce, which was starting to become amicable after many rough months, then spiraled. The agreement that they had to share custody fell apart, and their divorce was finalized in December of 1996. As a result of the rampant speculation about his involvement, and his admittedly adversarial response to it, Glenn lost custody of his other two daughters. Despite his initial hopes of a reconciliation with Stacy, that never happened. Afterward, Glenn seemed to turn resentful and wanted to lash out. If not at the person that murdered his youngest daughter, then perhaps at the person he blamed for taking away the other two. This treatment only made Stacy feel worse, and so the spiral went, making things between Morgan's parents more and more toxic. As time went on, though, things became less contentious. The FBI announced that Glenn was no longer being investigated in 1998, roughly 2 years after Morgan's abduction, and that came with a big sigh of relief for him and his loved ones. After that, things between the family began to melt ever so slightly, and Glenn found himself talking to the rest of Morgan's family. Even his ex-wife Stacy, who continues to blame herself but has lived on for her other two daughters. She also became an ardent advocate for child safety laws in the state of Kentucky and throughout the region, and was very vocal when talks to implement the Amber Alert system began in the early 2000s. In the years that followed the discovery of Morgan Violi's body and the discovery of the red van she had been abducted in, news was a lot harder to come by. I don't want to say that the investigation seems to have stalled in this time frame, but that's the picture that's painted by the drop-off in reporting after March of 1997. In July of that same year, FBI officials told reporters that some of the original detective work might have been hastily done, and some of it likely needed to be reworked. To me, this indicates that a lot of the initial police work had not been properly documented, and as a result, it made the ensuing investigation hard to conduct. I can only hope that these issues were fixed, but the damage had likely already been done, to somewhat extent. The following year, it was announced that Glenn Violi was no longer being investigated in the case. Instead, FBI officials insisted they were looking at 3 suspects for possible involvement, having been unable to clear them but not having enough evidence to charge them with any involvement. Charles Riley, the new special agent in charge of the FBI throughout Kentucky, said the FBI did not have much physical evidence in the case, but they might have had enough to earn a conviction, should that ever come to pass. In July of 2001, 5 years after Morgan's murder, the FBI announced that the reward for information was being raised. They contributed $50,000 to raise the reward to $67,000 for any information leading law enforcement to the still unidentified culprit. A $25,000 reward still exists for this information, and is available to anyone listening. Fair warning, anyone listening, the next few minutes are going to be a bit of an editorial for me. One article that I found in my research for this story really stuck out to me. It was an article from the Park City Daily News that came out in October of 1996, following the discovery of Morgan's remains, but before they had been positively identified. In it, John Sivley, the supervisor for the Life Skills Incorporated Child and Family Services Center, talks about how the community around Morgan and her family needed to come to terms with the grief they felt. His words, although few, really struck a chord with me. Since becoming a dad, I've shied away from covering crimes involving children. I'm sure some of you have noticed. It's not because I find these crimes any less important, but I just find it a lot more difficult. It's honestly just hard for me to process the emotions involved in a story like this. I'm not trying to say at all that those without kids don't have the same emotions or anything like that. It's just a different type of emotional vulnerability when you have a child. It's not stronger or more profound or anything like that. It's just different. It's hard to describe. But the words of this article really helped me come to grips with why I took an interest in true crime in the first place. On Grief, per John Sivley.
People experience the stages in different ways, and some experience them faster than others. Some people try to stuff their emotions. This only increases depression. Allow the community as a whole to grieve, cry, and vent their frustrations.
It took me seeing this comment to really make me understand what drew me to true crime in the first place. When I first became an avid true crime reader years ago, what drew me to it, beyond just the macabre details, was the realization that it was one of the few entertainment forums that talked about not just death, but loss on an emotional level. I know that these stories affect all of us differently, but to me I've always been most strongly touched by the stories of the people involved, beyond just the victims, but their loved ones who also experience significant loss. And I've always found that through learning their immense hardship, I can myself develop the strength to persevere through just about anything. Not to sidetrack too much, but my real interest in true crime started about a decade ago, when things in my life were admittedly not going well. I had some personal issues that caused me to drop out of a university I was attending, and I was just struggling to find myself and keep my life together. It went on for a couple of years. I'm lucky that I had an amazing spouse to lean on, but a lot of my emotional strength came from the knowledge that other people had endured something leagues beyond any type of suffering I had gone through. And if they could go on after suffering such a tragic loss, then I could get through my own bullshit. So that kind of brings me back to John Sivley's quote about how we all experience grief in different ways, but importantly, we need to process it in order to heal. I think that we as a society need to keep these stories alive in order to process this grief. After all, Morgan's story isn't one that gets talked about often. Before a couple of weeks ago, I didn't even know her name. Now I know a lot about her, and sadly, about how her life came to an end. But the grief that I've felt learning about her story pales in comparison to what her family has felt for decades. And I think that we all owe it to Morgan herself to talk about it, to keep her story alive, and more importantly, to try and heal this open wound that has been perpetrated upon her loved ones. While this case is still currently unsolved, advancements in DNA technology continue to move incredibly quickly, and they are making cases that were once deemed unsolvable very solvable. And I think that the only way this story stays alive is if we keep it alive. That means people like me getting over my fears about, feeling too much. We need to feel these things. And the only way for anyone to heal from this story is to talk about it. Sometimes that involves discussing the grim details in the hopes that it leads to someone somewhere remembering something. Or, us just trying to discuss difficult subjects. After all, forgetting about this story or the heinous details only lets the offender off the hook. And to that I say fuck him. I can only hope that this case receives a big push in the media and leads to investigators taking another look at this case. Who knows, maybe the investigators go through their old case files and discover a lead they overlooked, or something that did not look good back in 1996, but now does. Hopefully that leads to investigators learning or relearning the offender's name, and circling around him while he's still alive. The least he can do is make peace with the fact that he will forever be linked to this atrocious thing he did. And if he had any respect or honor in his heart, he would come forward to prevent his metaphorical and literal grave from being pissed on for the rest of eternity. Now, I'm sorry for this editorial. I just had to say a little something. I'll end this little segment with the words of Reverend Steve Ayers, who performed Morgan's funeral service in November of 1996.
This particular individual who did this has not gotten away with it. They are going to have to live with this hideous act the rest of their lives.
In November of 2015, a man named Timothy Madden came onto investigators' radar when he was accused of raping and killing a 7-year-old girl named Gabby Doolin in Scottsville, Kentucky. On November 15th of that year, Gabby had been performing as a cheerleader at her brother's football game, and at some point encountered 38-year-old Timothy Madden, whose son was also playing in the same game. Timothy seemed to take advantage of Gabby's youthful naivete and led her out into the nearby woods, where he sexually assaulted the 7-year-old before strangling and drowning her in a nearby pond. He left her body there, and she was later found by police floating in the same pond. Later, when being interviewed by investigators, Timothy Madden was singled out as a potential suspect. Later, DNA linked him to the crime, when blood from Gabby was found on his underwear and belt. He later confessed to the crime and pleaded guilty, and in 2019 was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Timothy Madden, as it turns out, grew up in Scottsville, Kentucky, about 25 miles southeast of Bowling Green, and about halfway between it and White House, Tennessee, where Morgan Violi's body was dumped. He felt comfortable enough abducting a 7-year-old from a sporting event, and thought he would just be able to get away with raping and killing her. It had proven to be a crime of opportunity, just like Morgan's abduction had been. As highlighted by members of the Web Sleuth's message board, younger pictures of Timothy Madden share a striking resemblance to the police sketches distributed by Morgan's abductor from 1996. Timothy Madden, who would have been 19 years old at the time, is pretty close to the approximate age estimated by police, who suspected Morgan's abductor to be between 20 and 30 years old. Madden had collar-length brown hair at the time, just like Morgan's abductor, and stood around 6 feet tall with a slim build, and seems to have been in good shape throughout his life. He had a rather defined larynx, just like the suspect sketch, and most importantly, he seems to have had a sharp and distinct nose, which police have always emphasized when talking about their own sketches. While the resemblance between the two isn't 100%, it is pretty damn close. And not only was Madden a lifelong resident of this area, but the only crime he's known to commit is the abduction, rape, and murder of another 7-year-old. While I doubt Timothy Madden is the only remaining suspect in this crime, it's hard to ignore him as a strong possibility. "2015 was pretty notable for this story in a different way. That year, the band Cage the Elephant released their album Tell Me I'm Pretty. The band, which was formed and came out of Bowling Green, Kentucky, shares a surprising connection to this story. 2 of the band members, Brad and Matt Schultz, lived in the same apartment complex as Morgan and her family at the time of the abduction. In the years since, they've talked a bit about how the story impacted them as children at the time. I mentioned their album Tell Me I'm Pretty because one of the songs on it, Sweetie Little Jean, is about Morgan Violi and her disappearance. It was written from the point of view of the band members as children, knowing that something terrible has happened, but not having the emotional maturity to handle it quite yet. At the end of this episode, if you're interested, I'd recommend you give it a listen, knowing what you know now, and let me know what you think. Decades have now passed, and the life Morgan Violi once lived is gone. Her loved ones continue on as best they can though, despite her no longer being there with them, never getting the chance to grow old. The stories of Morgan's mother and father were well documented in a lot of the reporting on this story, but 2 important people who I haven't spoken much about are Morgan's sisters, who were just a few years older than her at the time. Children at the time of Morgan's death, they are now both grown, with lives and children of their own. Her sister Nikki, who was 10 years old back in 1996, told reporters with the Bowling Green Daily News in 2016,
"You have your bad days, you have your good days. It will never be something I can process. My kids will never know her. My wedding was the hardest day for me. I went to the cemetery and cried because I knew she wasn't going to be there."
At the time of Morgan's abduction, all 3 sisters shared a bedroom, and then, in an instant, 1/3 of its occupants were ripped away from them, never to return. Morgan's other sister, Heather, told the Bowling Green Daily News in 2022,
"Growing up, I was very angry at people. I was very angry at the gossip. I was angry about what it did to our family, and I took things extremely personal."
Like Nikki, Heather has gone on to live her own life, but still remembers her baby sister, who she once remembered as more than just a murder victim. She continued,
"Morgan was very sweet, caring. She was just a baby. I think people forget that. They only think of her as an incident, a horrible thing that has happened. But I want people to remember, if they've ever known her, the sound of her voice, or her fat itty-bitty stubby fingers, or how she was so happy to do a cartwheel and barely land on her feet. I just think that they really need to remember her as a person, as a baby, and if anyone has information, to please come forward."
Nikki also stated back in the 2016 article,
"I'd like to see who did it in my lifetime. All we can do is hope we can find answers."
Nearly 30 years after Morgan's abduction, it remains increasingly hard to believe that her case will ever get solved. But that's not to say that it won't. As I mentioned earlier, advancements in DNA technology have made it so that decades-old cold cases that nobody believed would ever get solved have found closure. Cases like the Golden State Killer, the murder of April Tinsley, the Delphi murders, etc. Yet it's still difficult to imagine this one finding resolution, as stated by FBI Special Agent Richard Glenn in 2014, nearly a decade ago.
"As time goes by, it's harder and harder to pin down where someone was in 1996.
Police officials never released any details in Morgan's murder, such as her cause of death or if she had been sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, it's probable that she was. Yet those details likely provide distinct clues to investigators, who have since tried to tie them to other crimes in the region. Hell, around the country. The evidence that they once compiled is likely still there, just waiting for the right circumstances to get matched up with Morgan's killer. Federal investigators believe that the suspect was a white man in his mid-20s at the time of the abduction, meaning he would likely be in his mid-50s as of this recording, but perhaps just a little younger or a little older. He had collar-length sandy brown hair and was believed to stand between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing approximately 140 pounds at the time with a slender, muscular build. He had a tan complexion and a sharp, distinct nose, a note that almost all witnesses emphatically agreed on. He possibly had a mustache and some beard at the time, and was seen driving around the stolen maroon van that abducted Morgan. Yet, he may have also had a connection to the white Ford van, which had a unique, slotted glass window on the passenger side door. Sketches are available online, so check the show notes for a link. If any of these details stick out to you, or if you lived in the area at the time and think you might know something, please reach out to authorities. If you knew anyone that lived in this area at the time, Kentucky or Tennessee in July 1996, or maybe they even live somewhere in the greater Midwest, please reach out to them and see if they know. And please spread word of this case. There is so much information available in this story, but I rarely see it anywhere online. Please help share the story and try to help Morgan's loved ones find closure. The FBI continues to offer a $25,000 reward for information leading to the apprehension of the man who abducted and killed Morgan Violi. If you have any information, or even think you know something, please reach out to your local FBI office or your American embassy or consulate. You can also reach out to the FBI's office in Bowling Green at 270-781-4734, or the Bowling Green Police Department at 270-393-4244. Until such a time, the story of Morgan Violi will remain unresolved. Not gonna lie, this one was a hard one for me to work on. I touched on this in my editorial in the middle of the episode, but I was around Morgan's age when the story took place, and she has a pretty noticeable resemblance to my daughter. Just thinking of what her loved ones have had to endure, it's a lot. I know they probably don't care and probably won't listen, but my thoughts are with them and always will be. I hope that something we all take away from this story is that Morgan's sisters have tried to impart in recent years, that Morgan was not just a murder victim. She was a little girl who was all of the things I described at the beginning of the episode and always will be, even though she's no longer physically here. Those memories will live on amongst those she loved, and now in yours. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and produced by myself, Michael Whelan. The music throughout the episode was also composed by myself, except where noted in the show notes. I would like to give a big thank you to the regional reporting that covered this case as it unfolded. Publications like the Park City and the Bowling Green Daily News, the Courier Journal, and many more. If you would like to learn more about this case, please check out the FBI link in the show notes. There you can see pictures of the van and various police sketches. Now I would like to take a minute to thank the producers of this show who make each episode a possibility. These amazing souls include Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Randy Nordine, Alex Kellergopoulos, sorry I'm going to get that right one day, Ben Crocum, Derek Smith, Jacinta Class, James Weiss, Lauren Nicole, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Riddis Baugh, Sally Ranford, Sarah Rosario, Scott Misi, and Stephen Diaz. I'd also like to shout out the other patrons who continue to support the show. You can become a producer or a patron by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to our entire archive of bonus episodes, as well as the Patreon exclusive show Resolved, where I take a look at solved cases. To the rest of you, thanks for listening. Make sure to spread the word of this story and the podcast to anyone you think might be interested. And please, if you haven't yet, please log on and give the podcast a good review on whatever service you're listening to right now. It only takes a few seconds, but is immensely helpful in keeping the show alive. Also, if any of you are interested in hearing me talk about some more spooky stories, check out the podcast Unknown Horizons, which I host alongside my buddies Jesse Pollock and Zach Mummert. In it, we talk to people about the strange experiences they've had, be it true crime, paranormal, or some other unexplained phenomena. Give it a listen and subscribe, and if you have any experiences of your own, please reach out. You can find all of my contact information on the Unresolved website, unresolved.me. Once again, that's unresolved.me. Also, before we go check out that Cage the Elephant song. It's called Sweetie Little Jean. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Send those into my email too, or reach out to me on Instagram at unresolvedpod. I think I'll also open up a discussion thread on the Reddit for this show. That's reddit.r/unresolvedpodcast. Anyhow, that's enough for me. Until next time, I hope you all stay safe, and I'll talk to you later.